the topic of my talk is about belongs to the theory of argumentation. It's about a distinction that Douglas Walton makes between correct and incorrect appeals to ignorance. He has a strategy to study fallacies, and he thinks that there are general strategies of argumentation that have good instances and incorrect instances. And of course, we need some criteria to distinguish between the correct and incorrect instances of each strategy of argumentation. Well, the topic of my talk is one of those strategies, is the appeal to ignorance. So I begin with the general plan of my talk. I will repeat a bit what I just said. Then I will introduce Walton's characterization of the appeal to ignorance. I here say that is a preliminary definition, but Walton just gives this definition of what appeal to ignorance is. But I think that Walton has, if we read Walton carefully, we have to say that he understands the appeal to ignorance in a particular way that I will try to figure out which way it is. In the third place, I will present the two types of arguments that he considers good appeal to ignorance. These categories are mine: pragmatic arguments and argument based on evidence and lack of knowledge. I will criticize both types of arguments. I don't think that they are good appeals to ignorance. So my evaluation is negative in the end. Well, it's negative, at least concerning pragmatic arguments. I will try to say something different about the second type of arguments, because I think that the second category leads us to think a bit about how Walton understands this category. I think that he understands the appeal to ignorance in a non-traditional way. Well, that's the general plan. If I had more time, I would have talked about some type of arguments that I think that could be correct appeals to ignorance and Walton doesn't consider. But so maybe after the talk, I may have the chance to say something about those arguments. Well, Walton's approach to fallacies, he thinks that there are, as I said, there are correct and incorrect instances of general argument strategies, and you have to look for criteria to distinguish the correct and the incorrect fallacious instances. An example of a possibly correct ad hominem arguments, for instance, the ad hominem argumentation is one of those strategies that are Walton thinks that have correct and incorrect instances. For instance, this seems to be a correct instance. Do not trust Dr. Ramirez's diagnosis, since he has made several wrong diagnoses in the past. So it seems that one criterion for a correct ad hominem seems to be that the flaws ascribed to a person in the premises, for instance, the premises is he has made several wrong diagnoses in the past, that flaw must undermine her authority concerning the position he defends, for instance. It seems that seems to be a minimal requirement. This is just an example to give you an idea of what Walton's approach looks like. So we now define what he thinks the appeal to ignorance is. So according to Walton, the appeal to ignorance is a strategy that has correct and incorrect instances. He defines the strategy by means of these two sub-strategies. So proposition P is not known to be false, therefore it is true, or proposition B is not known to be true, therefore it is false. I want to make a clarification. We don't, in the instances of these strategies, we don't need to talk about truth or falsehood. We might just say assert P and then conclude not P. Well, sorry, assert that we don't know P and then conclude that not P, or assert that we don't know not P and conclude P, right? And I will address the question of whether there are correct instances of these two sub-strategies. So, no. Okay. Pragmatic arguments. This is the first type of presumably good appeal to ignorance. This is an example Walton gives. I don't know that this rifle is unloaded, therefore it is reasonable to presume that it's loaded. That is a direct quote of a passage of a book by Walton. But I want to say that if we want to think what he's saying in terms of the strategies, we need to think that this person is concluding that the rifle is loaded. And he says this, in this case, the argument from ignorance could be reasonable, even though I may have not good evidence to indicate whether or not, in fact, the rifle is loaded. It may be reasonable to conclude that I should commit myself to the proposition that is loaded, at least until I find out one way or the other. Look, the word commit myself, I mean, it's like a doxastic commitment. So it seems that I am concluding that the rifle is loaded, right? So the argument would look like, I think that there are an implicit premises, one implicit premise at least, that says, well, it's dangerous to handle a loaded rifle. And so if I include this implicit premise, the argument will look like this. The two premises: I do not know that the rifle is unloaded. The second premise: a loaded rifle is dangerous because it can be accidentally fired. And the conclusion would be the rifle is loaded. Well, I have two objections to considering this a good argument. I think that is a bad argument. As a consequence, it is not a correct appeal to ignorance. That's my thesis. I think there is no proper relation of support between the premises and conclusion. Traditionally, it is assumed that in a correct argument, this relation is such that the premises evidentially support the conclusion, in the sense that the premises, if true, count as evidence for the conclusion, for a rational being that understands the premises, the conclusion, and the inferential relation. Of course, I'm not saying that in a deductive valid argument, for instance, the relation of support could be something else that an epistemic relation. It could be something else. When we say that it is impossible that the premises are true and the conclusion false. But what I'm saying is that if I understand the premises, the conclusion, and their relation, the premises count as evidence for me. And in non-deductive arguments, I even think that the relation is epistemic. But that, I won't address that issue now. Well, in the case of pragmatic, what I'm saying is that this kind of evidential support is present in any correct argument. In the case of pragmatic arguments, the premises do not give evidential support for the conclusion. And Walton says nothing to motivate his way of understanding the relation of support. Well, I think that we can see there is no evidential support by comparing these arguments with the second type of arguments that Walton talks about, the ones that I call arguments based on evidence and lack of knowledge. As Walton points out, in such arguments, there is a usually implicit premise that is supported by evidence, and that's if P, not P, were true, we will know it. Or alternatively, if P, not P, were true, we will probably know it. As Walton observes, in light of any of these counterfactual conditions, the premise that states the absence of knowledge counts as negative evidence. So, a simple example. Mr. X has never been found guilty of breaches of security or of any connection to the KGB, even though the security service has checked his record. We can conclude that Mr. X is not a KGB spy. Walton said that here we conclude that this person is not a KGB spy based on our ignorance that he's a spy, and on evidence that supports a conditional that state that if he were a KGB spy, we will probably know it. Because of the investigation that the security service has carried out. And we know that the security service carries out a very good investigation, etc. The point I want to make here is that there is no such conditional working as an implicit premise in pragmatic arguments. And so the premise that says that we lack knowledge doesn't count as negative evidence. That's my thesis. And so there is no relation of evidential support, which is in which we traditionally understand the connection between premises and conclusion in an argument. A possible reply that someone could make to my objection that will lead us to our second objection. It can be said that there are some philosophers who have defended the correctness of arguments similar to Walton's pragmatic arguments, and so his view we could think is not entirely unsupported. For instance, Pascal and James will have defended an argument to the following one. If God exists, believing that it exists causes significant benefits, and then we can conclude that it's convenient for me to take measures in order to form such belief. This is not, as it is, an argument that has no evidential support. I think that there is evidential support between the premise and the conclusion here, but Walton, Pascal and James believe that this argument shows that it's rational to believe in God. And so we may think that these authors will also defend this type of argument. If God exists, believing that it exists causes significant benefits, God exists as a conclusion. Well, our counter-reply. I think that this argument is very controversial. It has received many objections. So Walton needs to say something anyway. But I think that leaving aside this worry, this last argument is not analogous to Walton's pragmatic arguments, because in Walton's example, the only thing that is necessary to prevent the rifle to be fired is to handle it with care, not believing that it's loaded. Thus, the only thing the agent needs to believe for practical purposes is that it's convenient, in light of what she knows, to handle the rifle with care. In Pascal's and James' argument, the benefits will arise directly from believing in God's existence. So I think even if we want to consider this a good argument, I won't address that issue, but even if we want to go that way, this argument is not analogous to Walton's pragmatic arguments. Okay, the second type, there is an alternative. This leads me to my second objection. There is an alternative, a more plausible explanation of the behavior of the agent in Walton's cases. We can explain the rationality of the behavior of the agent in Walton's cases by means of an argument where there is evidential support. And this kind of argument. I don't know that the rifle is loaded. I know the rifle is dangerous because it can be accidentally fired, and it's convenient in light of what I know to handle the rifle as it were loaded. I think that this is what is going on, and the conclusion is that there is no such thing as correct pragmatic arguments in the sense of, in the particular sense of an appeal to ignorance. That is correct. I'm understanding the category of pragmatic argument in that specific way. Okay, arguments based on evidence and lack of knowledge. I think that these are good arguments, but it's controversial whether we should call them appeals to ignorance. We have already introduced such arguments to compare them to pragmatic arguments. We said that in such arguments, there is a usually implicit premise that is supported by evidence. This type of conditions. So if P, not P were true, we will know it, or alternatively, if P, not P were true, we will probably know it. And in light of any of these premises, the first premise, the one that states that I lack of knowledge of the truth of some proposition, counts as negative evidence for the conclusion. Well, the same example again. Mr. X has never been found guilty of breaches of security or any connections with the KGB, even though the security service has checked his record. Therefore, Mr. X is not a KGB spy. Here we go, the same thing. Well, I will not repeat this. We have this kind of reconstruction of the arguments. We don't know, the first premise, we don't know that Mr. X is guilty of breaches of security or of any connections to the KGB. We have the second premise. If Mr. X were guilty of breaches of security or of any connection to the KGB, we will probably know it. So we can conclude that Mr. X is not a spy. The first premise counts as negative evidence for the conclusion given the second premise. Well, our objection is not. I concede that these are correct arguments. What I try to question is whether they should be considered as appeal to ignorance, as arguments from ignorance. As Copy points out, arguments like the previous one are correct, but do not seem to be genuine appeals to ignorance, since they appeal to knowledge. As Walton indicates, the previous arguments appeal to the knowledge of the truth of the second premise, which in turn is supported by our knowledge that spying for the KGB usually leaves evidence, and that an investigation led by the security service is likely to find it. Walton replies to this objection simply by claiming that it is still natural to classify such arguments as appeal to ignorance, since they, after all, appeal to lack of knowledge in the first premise. And as we saw, Walton understands the relation between schemas 1 and 2 and their instances in a flexible way that allows you to introduce implicit premises, more premises than the ones that appear explicitly in the schemas.
Just sorry, 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. I think that this is not a good reply to Copy's objections, since any non-deductive arguments appeal to the lack of knowledge that the conclusion involves. This answer seems to render all non-deductive arguments appeals to ignorance. It seems any non-deductive arguments has an implicit premises that says that we know that we don't know that, for instance, in this case, that there is an Uruguayan that doesn't speak Spanish, for instance. An epistemic premise that says that we don't know that there is an Uruguayan, a non-speaking Spanish Uruguayan. So I think that this leads us to think about how Walton understands the appeal to ignorance. As we saw, for Walton, the argument from ignorance can have more premises than the one that appears in the schemas. I want to suggest that for Walton, there is no distinctive relation of support between premises and conclusion in an appeal to ignorance. For instance, he considers an appeal to ignorance an argument based on knowledge and evidence, where a lack of knowledge and evidence, where the conditional doesn't talk about probability. So, an example. Someone wants to find out whether a train whose destination is Amsterdam stops at Schiphol. He sees that the schedule published in the train station does not indicate that the train stops at Schiphol. Insofar as this person has good grounds for thinking that the policy of the station is to include all the stop trains, insofar as this person has good grounds for thinking that the policy of the station is to include all the stops in the train schedules, she can reason as follows. And this is a deductive argument, a valid deductive argument. I don't know that the train stops at Schiphol. If the train stops at Schiphol, I will know it. The train does not stop at Schiphol. What I want to say is that here, strictly speaking, there is no ignorance. So I think that Walton considers that the previous argument is an appeal to ignorance, despite the fact that the agent is not in a state of ignorance concerning P, or not P. This, I think, shows us that for Walton, there is no distinctive relation of support between premise and conclusion in an appeal to ignorance. And I think that Walton understands in a conversational way the appeals to ignorance. According to Walton's notion of an argument from ignorance, the premises that appear in the schemas must be explicitly formulated because of not being salient in context, whereas other premises, like the ones that express knowledge, can remain implicit because of being salient in context. And I think that one understands an argument from ignorance in this way. It is clear that there are correct instances of an appeal to ignorance, but it's not the traditional way of understanding what an argument from ignorance is. And I will stop here, but I want to say that I think that there is one more category of arguments from ignorance that could be correct arguments from ignorance, and that Walton doesn't consider. And one more clarification. Usually, in the literature about the argumentation from ignorance, a type of example that always appears that have to be with arguments that are used in legal contexts. I think that those arguments could be understood as pragmatic arguments, and Walton understand them in that way. So I didn't talk about that kind of legal arguments like, well, we don't know that he's guilty, so we should conclude that he's innocent. But I think that they could be seen as, if we think that those are genuine pragmatic arguments, I think that we are seeing them as pragmatic in some sense. And I don't think that they are really appeals to ignorance. I think that they are, in practice, they are good arguments, but we shouldn't understand them at face value. That's what I think. Okay, I stop here.
Thanks, Matias. We have a question from Fabian. Do you think that Walton's case for appeal to ignorance is on par with contextualist knowledge, namely, the correctness of attitude statements relies on the context of use of the sentential attitude?
Can I read that question?
Yeah, it's on the chat here.
What do you mean by contextualist knowledge? Are you thinking about knowledge ascriptions? Like when I say that somebody knows something?
I'm sorry, Matias, is it about my question?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, because the connection is very low in my home. Sorry. Yes, my question was about the connection between Douglas Walton's approach to reasoning and the contextualist theory, according to which the meaning of knowledge, of the meaning of belief, the meaning of such attitude propositions may depend on the context.
Depend on context. I don't see a direct connection, but
the way to do it.
I don't see I mean, as I understand these theories about knowledge ascriptions, I think that we have ways of understanding sentences that depend on context. So it's like, right? In McFarland terms, at least, if we are indexical contextualists, we say different things with the same sentence in different contexts, right? Are you thinking about that? So, ways of evaluating or ascribing content to sentence in ways that are dependent on context? Are you thinking about that? Because the correctness it has to be with an evaluation, at least. So
his connection is very poor. So
what I will, yes, I cannot hear him. But what I will say is that I don't see a straightforward connection, because Walton use of context has to do with figuring out which implicit premises there are in a particular context. So, but he doesn't say anything about how to understand a particular sentence in context. So he has, I don't know what he thinks about that, but at least the theory that doesn't say about about fallacies doesn't say anything about how to understand, for instance, a particular sentence, a particular predicate. He just says, well, his units of analysis are the whole argument. And when somebody presents a whole argument, well, there might be an implicit premise, but it's not, the units are not sentences. So I don't see exactly how to make the connection, because the theories are about how the content of a predicate or the evaluation of a predicate varies with context, and the units of analysis here are bigger. So I don't know exactly how. Maybe we can make a connection or not. I don't know.
We have another question from Itamar. Do you think that at the end of the day, an argument from ignorance simply points to a lack of evidence, which turns out to be meaningful for the argument to be sustained?
If I didn't quite understand the question, so that's why.
Okay. We can. I don't know if Nitamar wants to.
An argument from ignorance simply points to a lack of evidence, which turns out to be meaningful for the arguments to be sustained. Well, I think that's a very difficult point. I mean, if we understand the category in a traditional way, we shouldn't allow knowledge to be included in the premises. And if we understand the category in that way, it's very difficult to find a good instances of an appeal to ignorance. It's much more difficult. I think that we can try to think about one category that fits that description. When we appeal to some sort of methodology, we can think that there is a principle of rationality that leads you to conclude, for instance, that if you don't have any evidence to posit the existence of an entity, you should conclude that that entity does not exist, something like that. But that would be a methodological rule of inference of rationality. But I don't know if there is actually that, if we reason using that principle. I don't really know if that is a legitimate principle of rationality. I'm ready to defend it, but I mean, it's very difficult to defend a principle of rationality. And I think that this kind of principle, it's difficult to show that it is used every day, and it's controversial whether it is used in science. I tend to like this principle, but it's very difficult to defend it, because how do you defend a principle of rationality? It's very difficult. It's like trying to defend a rule of inference. You use the rule of inference in your argumentation, so it's very difficult to defend this kind of things in a non-circular way. But I think that's the only possible example of a good appeal to ignorance in the traditional sense, trying to appeal to some sort of rational principle of economy, something like that. I don't know if I answered the question.
We would have another question, but we don't have any more time.
Okay.
Thanks, Matias.